Hello, and welcome back to Things I Want My Kids to Know with me, Ted Bradshaw. Today, we're going to talk about something that I find really important, and I know I say that all the time, but but this one is a fundamental one, which is that none of us see the world the way that it is. We all see things a little bit wonky. Not only do we all see things a little bit wonky, but we're supposed to. And what that means and how we can use that is perhaps when we're getting upset or anxious or bothered about something, and we can see that maybe we don't need to be, and we can see all the reasons why it's going to be okay, and we get frustrated with ourselves that we're not being completely sort of cold and rational. It's helpful sometimes to know that, well, that's not how it's supposed to be. Brains aren't supposed to do that. The second reason it can be helpful, I think, and the other thing we're going to talk about today, is knowing that you don't see things the way that they are all the time helps you relate to other people, helps you understand when perhaps you're struggling to understand somebody else's viewpoint on something, or perhaps you think something's really obvious and you're finding it difficult that somebody else doesn't seem to be getting it the way that you do. So let's start with understanding why we all see things a bit wonky and what that can do for us. So first of all, let's take an example about why the way that we see things or perceive things is important. So an example I'm going to give is, if you were walking along the street and somebody was walking towards you, and it's somebody you knew, somebody you recognised, and you waved, and they just completely blanked you. Didn't acknowledge it, didn't smile, just carried on walking. There are a few different interpretations you might make. So you might have an angry interpretation. You might think, oh, how dare they, how rude, something like that. You might have an anxious interpretation. Oh no, what have I done? I must have upset them, or maybe they don't like me, that kind of thing. It might make you feel sad. So you might think, oh no, nobody likes me. I feel really lonely, something like that. Or it might be completely neutral, like, oh, never mind, they didn't see me. So the interpretation makes quite a big difference to how we feel. Same situation, different interpretations wind up with a different outcome. But the reason that we have different interpretations, how come we could have all those different interpretations, and what drives what kind of interpretation we might have, I think is quite an interesting thing to think about. So we all have, I think, the experience or the expectation that we should see things exactly as they are. Our experience of the world is that we're kind of looking out through our eyeballs like they're cameras, right? And that we are just recording and seeing things exactly as they are. But actually, it works kind of the other way around. Information is coming to your brain. So sights, sounds, smells, physical feelings, all the time. And your brain is having to make sense of what's going on. And there's so much information that it can't possibly pay attention to all of it to the same level of detail. If it did, you'd never get anything done. Like, you'd never get out of bed. Actually, what your brain is trying to do, or doing automatically, is filtering things out and actively looking for the most important things and ignoring the rest, which already gives you a skewed view of what's going on. So just as a small example of that, just while you're listening to this, there will be certain bits of information that are fading into the background. So there might be noises that are happening around you that you perhaps weren't aware of while you were listening to me. There might be physical feelings. So while you were listening, you might not have been completely conscious of the feeling of your cheeks on the chair if you're sitting down, or the feeling of your feet on the floor if you're walking. But now that we've spoken about it, maybe you can feel it. Maybe you can start to feel other things on your body, like the weight of your clothes on your skin, or how it feels. Like, now I'm really conscious of how my elbows feel in this jumper. I don't know why. This information is there, but your brain's not paying attention to it all the time. How does that help? So I think one of the things to cover, and we touched on this in an earlier episode, How to Help an Anxious Child, is that your brain's first job isn't to be reasonable and rational all the time. Your brain's first job and first priority, it has the capacity to be reasonable and rational, of course it does, but its first priority is to keep you alive. So one of the things it's trying to do is be on the lookout for information that might be relevant to keeping us safe. So let's talk about things like tigers. So if you walked into a room, let's say it was a classroom, and you saw desks, you saw kids sitting at the desks, you saw water bottles, a big computer, you saw a tiger, you saw some toys in the corner of the room, you saw some pens. One of those pieces of information, I'm about to cough, hold on, here we go. Let's have a little sip. Let's try that again. One of those pieces of information needs to stand out more than the others. So actually, it is useful for your brain to be able to highlight the tiger first. Like, oh, there it is. If your brain was the kind of brain that was paying attention to every single piece of information, it was going, oh, look, there's some desks, there's some people, there's a tiger. It's too late. You haven't responded quickly enough. What your brain wants to do is actively look for possible danger, highlight it so that you can take action, so that it can get you ready to run away or to fight the tiger. You know, like if you've ever watched a horror film or something that scared you a bit, and then that night there are sort of shapes in your house that keep sort of making you flinch, like your dressing gown hanging on the door looks like a person, that kind of thing. That is that in action. Your brain is actively looking for, where might there be possible danger? Let's jump to conclusions before we've really had the chance to check it out. So, summarize that a little bit. Brains are supposed to be on the lookout for danger, actively looking for things that might be important for us to survive. However, we don't all have the same reactions to the same things. And some of that is because each of our brains just operates a bit differently. So for example, one of the things that I worry about is whether people like me. Again, it's not a tiger, but sort of worrying about social stuff is relevant because fundamentally we're chimpanzees and we want to be in a group. Some of how I understand why might I be the person that's more likely to worry if I've gone past somebody and they don't see me, why am I going to have the anxious reaction, is potentially because of how my brain just works. Like I seem to have come out of the womb a bit shy and worried about what people think of me. But equally, I can see that there have been experiences that I've had that have added to that. So some of my experiences at school, worrying about not fitting in and not feeling like I fitted in a lot of the time, might make sense of why my brain might be slightly more on the lookout for, oh, have I done something wrong? Is it going to be okay? Are they all right with me? Brains that learn from experience are more likely to be able to avoid danger. So, for example, if you've been bitten by a dog, it would be helpful if your brain kind of held on to that experience and said, oh, we don't want that to happen again. Let's be careful of that. If you touch something that's bright red and it turns out it was hot and it burns you, it is useful for your brain to hold on to that and say, we don't want that to happen again. Let's be on the lookout for that again. So I suppose this is our first port of call. Understanding that your brain is supposed to see things a bit wonky and it is supposed to sort of jump to certain conclusions because it's just trying to make sure that you're kind of safe. It's helpful. Partly because now that I know that I don't always see things exactly as truth and that my brain kind of colours things for me, it helps me. So if I walk down the street and I see somebody, they don't acknowledge me, and I immediately have the thought of, oh no, what have I done? What if they don't like me? For me to be able to just hold in my mind that might not be true. It might not be that they don't like me. It might be that this is what my brain does. And it always has done, and it might do for a long time. That gives me a chance to pause and say, is that really true? Or might there be another explanation? Maybe they didn't see me. Or maybe, you know what, they don't want to talk to me, but maybe that's not to do with me, maybe that's to do with them. And maybe that helps me not get sucked into my version of the truth. I can just see that it's not necessarily the case, and it helps me hold back. The second reason it helps is maybe it helps me not be quite so frustrated with myself. So sometimes I can think, oh, come on, for Pete's sake. Are you doing this again? Why do you keep worrying about this all the time? But if I can talk to myself in a bit of a kinder way and say, well, look, brains aren't supposed to be rational and reasonable all the time, and you can see why you worry about these things sometimes. Perhaps it helps me be a bit more forgiving to myself. Perhaps I'm not going to jump straight on myself and have such a go. I might be able to say, oh, look, I know sometimes your brain jumps to these conclusions, but it's supposed to. You're not being weird. You're not being abnormal. It's all right. It's reasonable. That can be helpful. Let's talk a little bit about the second way that this stuff can be helpful. And that is in how we relate to other people. So knowing that we don't see the world exactly the way that it is and we all see it a bit wonky, it doesn't only apply to things like anxiety, it also applies to things that are important to us. I'm taking a detour again. Let's pause on this bit for a minute. So we think, again, we see things with objective truth, like I see the truth of this, but there are plenty of things that just don't work like that. So for example, if you were trying to describe to me why you like the kind of music that you like, can you tell me an objective reason why your music is kind of better than other music, if you like? Probably not. It's just something less tangible than that, something that you like. We all have different experiences of the world that aren't just about kind of being rational all the time. When it comes to understanding the differences in how brains work, it's not only this stuff about experience, sometimes it's just how brains process information. The example I'm going to give is how me and my wife, if I'm talking to you, my kiddos, your mum, we experience the world very differently. And one of the ways is simply stuff like sound. So for me, what's a reasonable volume in the car and what's reasonable for her is so different. And that isn't to do with an objective truth, like what's loud and what's too loud. It's her brain seems to interpret sound differently to mine. She seems more attuned to sound, so it will bother her more if it's really loud. It's uncomfortable. Whereas for me, I can handle loud noises and it's all right. But there are other things that bother me that wouldn't bother her. Or with things like detail. So one of the most helpful things that we have put on the table between the two of us is that we have a very different approach to detail. I once went on a course where part of what we were discussing was to do with the different ways brains process information. One of the things being, does your brain start with big picture or does it start with detail? And it's not as black and white as that, but it's a helpful kind of difference between different people. And we'd kind of arranged ourselves into two groups. So the people who thought that they were kind of more big picture first and struggled with the detail later down the line, and people who started with detail in order to create the big picture. I was in the big picture group, so that's very much how I sort of experienced the world. And we were looking at this really detailed old painting. So I don't know, like Tudor time, there's a bloke holding a load of stuff with a load of images around the sort of border of it. And we were asked, in 30 seconds, what are the first words that come to mind when you look at this picture? And when we came back together, the two groups, the detail group said stuff like a fish, a star, a bowl, a man, a hat, listing the things that were in it. Perfectly reasonable. But then us with the big picture, we were laughing because our list was very different. We'd written stuff like childhood and warmth. And I really remember just this kind of baffled experience that all of us had, hearing the other people describe what was going on. And I had this kind of light bulb moment that, this is really different for me and my wife. My wife is very much somebody who starts with the detail and sees detail very clearly, whereas I can see the big picture very easily, but I might struggle with the detail sometimes. Proofreading makes me just want to sort of sink into the ground because I find it really hard, whereas she's really good at that. She's really good at seeing those details. When we bought our first house, it was a new house, and one of the things they ask you to do is do what they call snagging. So you walk in and you have to walk around the house and point out anything that you think is off, anything you think is not quite right. We were both arriving from work, and I got there first, and I walked into the house, and they were showing me around, and I was looking, and I just went, yeah, looks good. And then my wife walked in, 10 minutes later, and she goes, there. She could just see all of these different bits and pieces that, I don't know, this is information that had gone in through my eyeballs, but it just hadn't registered as an issue. I hadn't clocked it. And the fact that we've been able to kind of identify this has allowed us to be able to have conversations about it. So that perhaps when there are things that we're struggling to understand about one another, for example, some of the DIY that I might have done, and my tolerance for it being kind of good enough, whereas for my wife, she might see it and see things that aren't quite right. It's not that she's trying to be picky, it's that it just stands out more to her than it does to me. And that's really helpful for us both to understand. It is not that I'm trying to be sloppy in any way, and it is not that she would have, overwhelming expectations. It's just she spots inconsistencies. I remember we, as a group of friends, we all walked into an Airbnb once. And as we walked into the lounge, my wife and one of my best friends both flinched, like physically flinched when they walked in. Went, "Oh, I can't look at that." And the rest of us were like, "What do you mean?" And when they pointed it out, there was two things on the wall that were just out of line with each other. These weren't lined up. Again, I'd walked in, I'd seen it, it just hadn't registered as an issue. Whereas for those two, it was something that stood out. Again, sticking with this example, I suppose, this has helped us to relate to each other. I can feel myself hesitating to tell the story. I'm just going to tell it. So there was one night when we had, a long time ago when the kids were really small. So I think our oldest was maybe 2. Well, it must have been slightly older, maybe 3, because we only had 2 of them at the time. And one of us was putting the oldest down, one of us was putting the younger one down. And I'd finished first, and I was like, okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. We've got this lovely chocolate pudding for us to have. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go and microwave it and get some ice cream ready for when she comes out, and then we can have that together and relax. So I get it all ready, bang on time for her to come out. I bring them in the lounge, and I sit down, just about to dig a spoon in, and my wife says, what about the toys? So what? What? And she says, what about the toys? And I look up, and there's just toys all over the floor. They're all over the floor. And she says, I can't relax and eat this until the toys are gone. And in my head, I'm thinking, but the pudding's hot. But the pudding's hot. Why don't we just eat it first, and then I'll tidy the toys away, no problem. And she says, I don't think you understand. I can't. I'm going to have to put them away. So I put my pudding down. I help her tidy away the toys. And I'm feeling a bit guilty because I'm thinking, well, maybe I should have seen that. But what I was able to express to her was, it's not that I walked in, saw the toys, and went, never mind, she'll do that. It's that it didn't register. Like, I've walked in, I've clearly seen them. It's gone in through my mind, but it didn't register as an issue. Certainly wouldn't have registered as a barrier to us eating this thing and being able to relax. Because in my head, I can relax whether the toys are there or not. Don't get me wrong, I prefer it being away, but it doesn't register as a problem. Whereas what my wife was able to express to me is it's almost like a buzzing sort of mosquito noise, or like the toys just things that are out of place just stand out more brightly to her than they do to me. And I think that's really helpful for me to understand and for her to understand. So actually, what that means for me is that, I don't want her to feel like I'm, ignoring things that are out of line and would bother her and leaving that all to her, because that's not fair, and I want her to be happy. But equally, it doesn't stand out to me and it wouldn't bother me, and that's useful for her to understand. It's not that I am seeing it, registering it as a problem and then leaving it. It doesn't compute in that way in my head. So instead of being able to express things like, but this is right, the toy should go away before we eat the chocolate pudding, that would be an objective truth. Somebody trying to say, that's just true, that's how you got to be. But if my wife tried to express it to me like that, I would say, well, that's not true. You can eat your pudding and leave the toys. That's what's true. You can do that. We can do it in whatever order we like. So we could keep trying to explain to each other what we think is correct in terms of fact and just keep missing each other. But when you're able to say, I know this isn't fact, but this is the way that it seems to me, I'd really love to know how it seems to you, things become so much easier. Things become so much easier. So something the other way around that my wife has done a really good job of trying to understand about me is when somebody is trying to arrange to do something with us, so we're trying to arrange a weekend or a visit to somebody texts and say, do you want to do this next Sunday? Sometimes I just won't reply. And what that's about, in my head, is if I know I can't make it work, I feel uncomfortable. So I feel like I'm going to let them down in some way, and maybe they'll be upset with me, or maybe they'll just be sad. So my brain would rather avoid it. It would go, leave it, just leave it. My wife doesn't have that same fear. She's a nice person. She wants to treat people politely and well, but she wouldn't find it a problem if somebody messaged her and said, sorry, I'm not around. She just wouldn't register that as an issue. Neither would I if it was the other way around. But when it's me, I feel like I'm causing harm in some way. So me being able to express to her, because it can be frustrating sometimes. Sometimes she'll be like, oh, have you replied to that person? I'll be like, no. Me being able to express, I'm not trying to, I don't know, be annoying. It's just sometimes it makes me uncomfortable. Helps her perhaps be more understanding towards me about why that might be difficult for me. It's not that she understands it in terms of her own experience, but she can understand and hold in her mind, well, that's how it feels to you. Same way that I can hold in my mind that things being out of line or things being messy bother you, even though they don't bother me. The phrasing that can be really helpful here is something along the lines of, instead of just repeatedly saying, it works like this, why can't you see it works like this? Is to say, this is how it works in my head. And express your view, your opinion, make it really clear that it's an opinion or a view. I'm curious to know what you make of that. And I'd really love to know how it works in your head. And then listen and be interested. One of the greatest pleasures, I think, of life is getting to know the other ways that people think that aren't yours. It opens up a whole world of stuff and is endlessly interesting, I think. But it also just means that it's slightly more likely, maybe more than slightly, that you're actually going to be able to understand one another. And you're actually going to be able to feel understood as well. Rather than just thinking, you haven't heard what I've said, so I'm just going to say it again, but louder. Which is sometimes what we fall into instead. So, we all see things wonky, or we all see things differently. We're all supposed to. So when you find yourself feeling frustrated with yourself because maybe you don't feel like you're being rational or reasonable, just remember you're not supposed to. That's not what brains are supposed to do. And when you find that you see things differently to somebody else, try and be interested, try and be curious. Don't dismiss your own thoughts or feelings, but express them as that. This is the way that I see it, rather than this is the truth. Thank you for listening. I hope it's been helpful. If there's more you want to know, there's loads of different places you can go. So first of all, there are bonus episodes of this particular podcast. I don't understand the technological side of it particularly. I've set my podcast up on Substack. So if you're interested in hearing bonus episodes, going directly to Substack is one way you can sign up for that. Or the bonus episodes show up via Spotify podcasts. If you're listening on Apple, you might have to go to one of those places in order to find the bonus podcasts, but then you'll be able to make them appear in your Apple stream if you want to. Alternatively, of course, you can find more of my videos and more information everywhere on all social media on CBT TED. And if you have any questions you'd like me to answer in a future Q&A episode, or anything you want to just sort of suggest as some topics, drop me a line. It's pod@cbtted.co.uk. Cheers.